Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And Alex just returned from the Blackwater, potentially the Blackwater capital of the world, Anilao. So then it comes as no surprise that we're going to talk a little bit about Blackwater today, and specifically the lens options for Sony shooters with regards to Blackwater shooting, as there doesn't seem to be one particular go-to option, and there are quite a few. So Alex, take it away.
Yeah, and I hope that this episode is of interest to more than just Sony shooters. But I think it's a question that I constantly get asked about, and I constantly see debate and discussion about. And I think this episode will go some way to explain perhaps why that is, more than anything else. I hope that it's of interest to others because, while there may be favoured lenses on other systems, I think it is interesting to understand this problem and maybe take from it some options that you hadn't thought about for your system, if you're not a Sony user. I think a good place to start is to talk a little bit about Blackwater and what's the right lenses for Blackwater. Most of the subjects in Blackwater are pretty small, but some can be bigger. You have plenty of subjects that are very much fingernail size. You have a few subjects that are kind of thumb sized, and maybe a few that are kind of spread out hand sized. But most of the stuff is kind of thumb down to fingernail size. And therefore it's very much in the realms of macro shooting. The challenge of Blackwater photography is very much the diving challenge more than any technique challenge. Most Blackwater shots are taken on exactly the same camera settings with the same strobe setups and all that stuff. The challenge is finding the subjects, first of all, which involves a lot of hunting at night, and then framing them up accurately, and then focusing on them accurately. And the framing and the focusing and the finding, but particularly the framing and the focusing, really reward great diving skills. And I think more than anything, if you are struggling to get things in focus, to get things framed up properly when you're doing Blackwater dives, my best advice is rather than look at your camera and your lens choice, is maybe, look at yourself and say, yeah, I probably need to work a bit better on my diving skills, and also probably want to maybe add some buoyancy to my camera to make sure my camera is nicely trimmed as well. And it's not just comfortable to dive with when I'm holding it down here. It's also when I hold it up here, it doesn't wobble me about. But to get onto the lens issue, I think there have been 4 options that I've heard regularly talked about as for stills photography with a Sony full frame camera, particularly for Blackwater photography. The first of those is the most popular Sony macro lens, which is the 90mm. The second of those is Sony's very unpopular macro lens, the 50mm. Another option that is, has got a real following is using the EMWL lens with the 90mm, but with the 100-degree lens on the EMWL, it becomes a very wide lens, but because the end of it is so small, and if you're photographing something about the size of a thumb, you can easily maneuver that lens right up very close to it, and because it's so close, the aiming problem kind of goes away, and that's a very popular solution. And then the final of those 4 options is using an adapted 60 or 50mm macro lenses, either the Nikon AFS 60mm or the Canon 50mm that you use, both of which need to be used on adapters, and those adapters, potentially bring some problems in. So last time I went to Anilao, I was really happy with the 90mm, and that was my go-to option on the Blackwater dives. I'd quite often use it with a 5T, and this trip I used it exclusively with the MFO. I never took the MFO off once when shooting the 90mm on a Blackwater dive. I never had a subject that was too far away to shoot with the MFO, so it was a perfect solution, and it meant that my camera wasn't then focusing at distances that it can't focus on in the dark. It basically ran to the end, and then it came back again, and the subject was in that sort of range. I've heard people talk about, you can use the limit of focus on the macro lenses. I would say, annoyingly, those limit ranges are not well set up for underwater photography. And the fact that you can't switch those limit switches underwater, I think make the lenses mean those limit switches are of little use underwater. If you use them with a close-up lens, that's a big mistake, because a close-up lens is going to set your focus range much closer to the camera anyway. And if you limit that, you basically cut that focus range massively. So you need the full focus range of your original lens if you're using a close-up lens like an SMC or even the MFO, but particularly the SMC.
What are your thoughts on this? This is something, and I shot this combination not for Blackwater, but a long time ago, especially up at God's Pocket, was shooting a 50 or 55 millimeter prime on a short extension tube, because then it brings the focus much closer, and those lenses are significantly faster focusing than most of the shorter macro length options, and are great for shooting stuff, that size to fist size. Obviously you'd sacrifice things that are really tiny. But if you're like me, when I do Blackwater, I'm not interested in stuff that's that small. It's cool to see. I have no real interest in photographing it. I like the bigger stuff. So that would be an option that I would look into, versus adapting or Canon or Nikon onto Sony, would be to get one of those other primes and a short little extension tube.
So I looked at that solution with Sony, and Sony make a whole range of like 30 mil, 40 mil, 50 mil primes.
Yeah.
But the problem is the lack of extension tubes. Is that as lenses get wider, so you need shorter and shorter extension tubes. Otherwise, the focus just ends up too close. And I couldn't find the right length extension tubes, which I think would probably need to be about 8 or 9 millimeters with those lenses to have a good working focal range. So that you end up having to use a longer focal length extension tube, and it pulls the focus just too close.
Yeah.
So you end up with kind of like a semi-super macro setup.
Yeah. I think the one I shot with those was like 12, which was still maybe a bit too long. But I wonder if even for certain things it might still be useful. But like you said, ideally you would have one that's a tiny bit shorter. It's just that nobody makes them, except Nikon might have made one a long time ago. But finding that would be the challenge there. You're right.
Yeah, and obviously you want one that's really communicating properly with the lens, because the whole point of going down that route is to have good autofocus.
Yeah.
So that's okay. That's number 5, and I would say as number 5, I had a look at that route. I had a good chat with Sony. They make really nice 40 mil, which I thought might be made a really good macro lens on an extension tube, but I couldn't find I have got some Sony extension tubes, but I couldn't find one that was short enough to make to keep the focus range manageable. They were all the extension tubes were too long, and they were pulling the focus too close with the wide angle, because the extension tubes work differently depending on the focal length. So the first option is the 90 mil. And I would say that was my go-to. I've done far more Blackwater dives than 90 mil than any other. With the MFO one, I think it's really transformed, because it doesn't have a focus range where it hunts. The autofocus of the 90 mils are very fast, and I think it's a good solution. I prefer the Sony 90 mil to the Tamron, if that's what you were going to ask about. Oh. And that's really because of the fact that most Blackwater shooting, because you're shooting subjects against open black backgrounds, you want as much depth of field as possible. And particularly with the tinier subjects, you need that depth of field. So you're shooting a lot of the time f/18, f/20, and those apertures are not available on the Tamron. And even if you go at f/16, sometimes at f/16 it's too bright, and the quickest way to stop it being too bright is to shut your aperture down. So I prefer the Sony 90 to the Tamron.
What I was just going to ask you to do real quick, because there still seems to be confusion about it, and I know we've touched on it a lot, but in like a real quickly, can you explain what the benefit of the MFO is? Because I still see people online who are a bit confused about the purpose of it. So why it would be beneficial for Blackwater as well?
So first of all, the MFO is, Mike Bartik, who we just had on the show recently, had a great thing for it. He says, it's like that bit of software you install in your computer, you forget it's there, and it makes everything run faster. It's like a make it better button. You put it on and forget about it. And I put my MFO on the day dives in Anilao, and I hardly ever took it off, and there was nothing that I couldn't shoot with it. Yeah. It gives you a bit more super macro than the lens does naturally, and it stops your lens focusing, more than say a meter away, which you're never going to try and shoot anything from that far away anyway. So it just basically makes things better. It gives you better close focus. It improves the image quality underwater, because it if you've watched our recent Curve Port episode, which may not be out by the time this goes out, but it should be out before this, it does some of that job. It improves the image quality out to the edges of the frame. So you basically stick the MFO on and use it, and it makes your camera better, makes your pictures better, and you forget about it. It allows you, if you find small subjects, say you found a nudie that's kind of this sort of size, it's too big for an SMC. But
Yeah.
with an MFO, you can really fill the frame with it, whereas with a standard macro lens, you can't. So it just brings this host of makes things easier for you. And
Cool.
it's something that it will become by far your most used accessory, because you'll just shoot it the whole time. And, as soon as people try it, they get it. But until they try it, they don't get it. I had both the MFO prototype and the real one on this trip. And everyone I lend the prototype to, it goes on and they're just like, yeah, I want one of these. Or, and so, yeah. So that's the MFO. And it's very good for Blackwater as well, because generally nothing's going to be that far away on a Blackwater dive. So that's the prime option. Next on my list was the 50mm. The 50mm Sony lens is a very slow focusing lens, but as an angle of view, it's a great angle for Blackwater. The advantage of a wider macro lens for Blackwater is it's easier to find something in a wider viewing lens when you're searching for the subject. It's easier to hold it still. If you wobble a bit, it doesn't disappear out of the frame or anything like that, so you don't lose the subject in it. And because it gets closer to the subject, you can shoot through less water column, and that's an advantage too. And because the lens is wider, at a set distance, you're getting more more depth of field than you would with a longer macro lens. So if I'm a foot away from the subject with a 50mm, I've got more depth of field, and depth of field is always a good thing on a Blackwater dive. So wider macro lenses are good for Blackwaters. It's why the Nikon, shooters tend to favor the 60mm over the 105 for Blackwater all the time. And the 50mm is even better still almost. The problem with it is it's very slow focusing, and Blackwater photography really puts the pressure on focusing. What I've found though is shooting the 50mm on the Blackwater dives is the key is to understand that it's slow to focus. And where it's slow in focusing is in racking the lens in and out to focus on stuff. Once it's in focus, it tracks around the frame as fast as any of the lenses. So the key to using it on a Blackwater dive and enjoying it on a Blackwater dive is to be experienced enough as a Blackwater photographer to know, okay, I'm going to go close to this subject, but I'm not going to start the lens focusing until the subject is almost in focus. So the first subject of the dive can be a bit annoying, and I quite often go and shoot the downline at the beginning just to get it focused. Then every subject from that, it's a case of I basically just don't autofocus and move in with the camera until the subject is in focus or nearly in focus. And only at that point do I start pressing the shutter. And then at that point, it focuses very quickly. So I think if you adapt your technique, the 50mm is a very good lens for Blackwater, but it requires that technique of you can't just go, where's the subject, hit the autofocus, you find the subject. You have to help it a lot. And if you do that, it's actually a very good Blackwater lens. And I would say the more I shoot it, the more I think it's probably become my favorite now for Blackwater. I would love a fast focusing 50mm as an ideal, but it doesn't exist. So the next option that is very popular, and particularly in areas where you've got more of the bigger subjects, is using the EMWL lens on the 90 and using the 100-degree EMWL lens. And this provides an even wider macro lens, basically. And that has advantages. I would say the downside of using that is if you use it with the long extension with the relay section in, it's a very, very long lens, and it's very hard in mid-water. There's a jellyfish floating in front of you, and you've got this massive long lens. You're back here. You're trying to line it up on the jellyfish. You can move in 4 dimensions or 3 dimensions at least, and it's really challenging. So if you have the reverse viewfinder, I would say that's much more applicable for Blackwater. It's a much shorter rig, but I still find the EMWR harder to aim or harder to hold steady because how long it is. A small movement back here is a big movement at the front. So I think it's fine as a solution. I enjoy using it as a solution. I got nice shots using it. But unless you know there's going to be lots of bigger subjects, I prefer the other two slightly. So I'd say it's my third place option. I'd probably say that the 50 is maybe edging ahead with experience. The 90 with the MFO is very sort of close second behind. And I'd say the MWL is kind of pretty close behind that. And I think that's one of the reasons there's been so much debate about this issue, is that actually none of them is perfect. They all have their strength. The 90 is a bit long,
Yeah.
the 50 is a bit slow focusing, the MWL is a bit hard to aim. But all three of them are actually pretty good, but none is perfect. And then the option is to use either the Canon 50mm that you have or the Nikon 60mm on adapters. And my experience with the Nikon 60mm on the Monster adapter is that it's just not reliable enough.
Yeah.
And the focus is a bit wayward. And, people have said, oh, you need to have a certain serial number of 60mm and then it works. I have the right serial number of 60mm. It doesn't do that. You've got to have the latest version of software in the adapter. And I had to connect my Sony to a PC in order to update it, which I did. And it's still rubbish. Blackwater's about spending your time hoping you're going to see this once in a lifetime subject.
Yeah.
I don't want a lens I don't trust in that situation. If I know I'm going in and I'm just going to shoot, little pteropods or something like that, sure, I'll shoot that lens. But not if there's the chance of something special turning up and the thing not being reliable. So that for me is the biggest aim against it. I know you found your Canon a bit more reliable than I find my Nikon.
Yeah. I haven't had any issues in terms of reliability. The thing I have issues with is that some days, and I have yet to figure out why, that Canon 50 on the Metabones is as fast or faster than the Sony 90. Then other days, it'll focus. It's similar to the Sony 50, where it is just glacially slow and takes forever. And as far as I can tell, I haven't done anything different in between those types of days. So it must just be
adapters.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that's why,
so fortunately, I would still use it on a Blackwater dive because I would shoot it similarly to how you shoot your Sony 50, where you focus it and just kind of go in on,
and then just use it for the last bit.
Yeah.
But if you wobble while shooting it a little bit, or the subject swims a little bit, it'll track it because it's not making a big change in focus. It works really well. It's just what it's bad at is if it's completely out of focus, trying to find its way back into focus.
Yeah. And there are ways I've found around that as well. You still have to be patient with it, but you're right. It's if it's something where it's locking up or won't focus at all, or just, all that kind of stuff, then I wouldn't bother shooting it. Fortunately, my copy, as frustrating as it can be sometimes, I've yet not had that issue. I'm sure I would go out on a Blackwater dive in the day I find, 8 paper Nautilus all stuck together is when that would happen. But fortunately, that
at least should be on the
yet.
50 though for that than the 90 because it's it'd be quite big.
Yep. But I think I would probably still opt for shooting the 50 over the 9. I don't have an MFO, so that might change my opinion. But if I were to go out on a Blackwater dive tonight, I would take the 50mm and just, like you said, adapt your technique to it and hope for the best versus shooting a longer lens. And again, we've been over this 1,000 times. I'm not a huge fan of the longer macro lenses compared to shorter ones.
I think that is where you dive, though, as much as anything.
True, of course. Yeah, because what I'm shooting here is larger. But if you don't have anything to add to that.
No, I was just going to summarize really that I think the reason this debate rages is there isn't a clear winner.
Yeah.
I think that all of those first 3, potentially 4, are worth considering. I would say that personally, I'd probably put the 50mm as my first choice now, especially, with that modified technique. I think the 90 with the MFO is a very strong second. And I think if you're expecting a dominance of smaller subjects, I'd probably go more with the 90mm. Yeah. If you know you're going to have some really fleeting, fast-moving, zippy subjects, then again, the 90mm, will go to the prime. The EMWL is a very powerful solution, but it's not as easy to shoot as you might imagine, just because of the difficulty of holding it. I think perhaps if I'd put a bit more effort into the buoyancy and the stability of the rig, maybe that would have made it a bit better. My rig was neutral, but it wasn't trimmed that well with the MWL, so maybe I should play around with that. And then I think the adapters have the potential to be the best of all, but in the reality aren't because they just because of adapter life.
Yeah. So Sony, if you're watching this, please release a fast focusing 50 or 60mm macro. That'd be wonderful. Take care of a lot of these problems. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. And we will see you soon back on the Underwater Photography Show.